good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ivan Sigal.
I'm Solana.
And we're going to talk about citizen media, online citizen media, and social movements today. And I have the clicker, but we're going to have a conversation. So we're going to be showing you some images and talking to you a little bit about ideas, both about Globalvoices and our history, and also about how we relate to and understand the question of movements and social movements more broadly, and its relationship to the internet and distributed populations and communities.
As friends and as colleagues, this is something that we discuss a lot. Globalvoices is an online community that has been growing over many years. We'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go along. But these are some of the people behind Globalvoices: bloggers, people who work with citizen media activism all over the world, especially in those parts of the world that we rarely hear from in international media. And we've been tracking citizen media over all these years, and we've noticed now that it's become something that really takes up a lot of space in the public consciousness. I mean, everybody understands Twitter and blogs and talk about Twitter revolutions and Facebook revolutions. And there's this whole debate and awareness about citizen media movements that wasn't there previously. And what we want to try and figure out is all this separate activity, does it constitute a global movement? What is the unifying force behind it, and why should it even matter? And I think one of the reasons that we're interested in identifying whether you can consider it a movement or not is to see whether you can push it in a direction, whether you can influence it, whether you can understand it better and give it a direction.
Yeah. And also, it also tells us a little bit about our relationship as individuals to ideas about movements. And we see a very common framing for a lot of the changes in the internet over the past 2 years about how revolutions are in some way perhaps determined by or influenced by new technologies, new information technologies. And I think our contention is a little bit different. It's not necessarily about a phenomenon. It's about participation and intention in terms of our behavior, and what happens when many people behave in a similar way or understanding a similar set of concepts and applying them in different places based on their own needs and priorities, and what kind of effects that has. And one of the things that Globalvoices does is we study these ideas, we study these communities, and we report on them. And the picture that we see is both more nuanced and more diverse, and also less polarizing a description than what we often see in mainstream media understandings of the issue.
Yeah, so I think partly because we follow it so closely. I mean, that was the previous slide is our homepage from today, and you can see that we have stories from different parts of the world, and they're all written by people who are from these countries, who track online discussions and who explain what is happening in their context and translate. And so we try and understand citizen media in the places where it's taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the elements of that larger story is that, for instance, starting with the Iranian revolts in 2000 and protest movements around the Iranian elections 2 years ago, is we started to see a discourse that said that if a movement didn't succeed in terms of setting goals and overthrowing a government, then it wasn't a movement at all, and it wasn't going to be successful, and it wasn't effective. In a lot of contexts, that issue was presented as if it was a surprise, as if it came out of nowhere, as if it wasn't grounded in history, and as if it was a phenomenon that needed to be understood or tackled as if it were opposite or other to what we are. And because we have been researching this kind of issue for 6 years as Globalvoices, and also many people in our community are some of the first bloggers in the world, starting from the mid-1990s. We have a somewhat different understanding that it's very grounded in long practice, long history, and attempts to build things and try tactics and try experiments to see what might work. And in a sense, the Iran story and the Arab uprisings of last year are a culmination of a story, a culmination of 10 years of practice. It's not something new.
This is what our website looked like
In 2005.
2005. And you can see it's a much simpler layout, much more similar to the kind of blogs that you would have seen then, if you knew what a blog was at that point. And we did the same kind of thing, but there was much less to report on. There was only a handful of bloggers in each individual country. A lot of them knew each other. And I think that's also part of what you're saying, that people look at it as it comes out of nowhere, but they also think of online movements as these vast crowds that have no identity, that are just unthinking masses of people. But it's true that you do have a lot of activity and thousands of people who are doing something in some cases, but you also have a core group of people, individuals who are organizing things. And a lot of these individuals know each other and have been working together for many years. So many of the people that we would have linked to here who were doing early blogging on China, Tunisia, all over the world, Africa, are still some of the people who are very influential today and who've played a part in growing their networks locally where they live.
That's right. So when we asked ourselves this question, is citizen media a movement? Is online citizen media a movement? We had to ask both the question of, the first question, which is what is citizen media, and we also had to visit the question of what makes a movement. And 2 minutes of sociology here. Social movements are, in general, or more traditionally, tended to be identified by several factors. The first is contention. They're pushing against something. They're pushing against a form, an existing practice, a power structure, and traditionally they have a goal. They have an articulated statement about what they're trying to do. And they work in a longitudinal fashion, trying over time to change the way something exists. They also have intention. So it's not enough to have something to push against. You have to have a clear idea and a vision and a statement about where you want to go. So the intention of your behavior. And the third thing is performance, which is that you have to enact or perform a set of ideas in order to garner community and to state in a public context your effect. So whether that's a demonstration, whether that's in an online context, a petition, or even offline, whether it's a rally, whether it's a terror movement, all of these things are performative in terms of how people move ideas forward within social contexts.
This is a theory that Ivan introduced me to, and it's from 1965. A guy named Harrison White came up with it, but we've spruced it up for the
internet age.
Yeah.
That's right. So we couldn't go too long without showing you a cat. Sorry. And the theory is actually called the catnet theory. But it's not at all about cats, because there is, of course, the theory that the internet is made up of cats and pornography. And we're not going to go into that one. This is something else. This is about the relationship between between categories and networks. So we have a fairly, you often hear the question of what makes something go viral, what makes something happen in a social context, why does a movement begin? And how do we understand when that thing has happened? Catnet theory is really interesting because it offers us a lens into articulating when something is going to happen or not going to happen based on a set of principles for how we engage the world. So the first idea is that human communities are structured in both categories and in networks. A network is something like a community of people who happen to all live in the same place. So the residents of Berlin are all potentially a network. We're bound by a structure, which is the municipality of Berlin. Categories of people are identities and cultures, self-formed. Men, women, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, musicians, pet owners. Symbols are, so the idea of catnet theory is that these things can exist sort of independently, and what is required for action is a place where categories and networks actually meet, where they cross. So you can have a community of people, a network of people who live in the same space, but they are essentially dormant in terms of their behaviors. They don't act, and it's unclear as to why they don't. And you can have a category of people who are all, again, pet lovers, but they don't have a common theme to gather around other than pets, and so they're not politically active, for instance. So again, this is a pre-internet theory. It's not dependent upon the internet, but these things cross around symbols. They cross around flags or identities or images that form to motivate the community in which they're working. So it's helpful to think about this kind of triangular concept of categories and networks and a symbol under which to rally around as a sense of understanding when something happens. And let me give you an example of that. Oh, it's a little blurry. So in Beijing in 2006, the municipal government instituted what was known as the one-dog policy. And the government decided that pet owners could not have more than one dog. And what resulted was, first online and then also in the streets, was a mass uprising of tens of thousands of people who protested the fact that they were going to have to lose their pets. And the same thing happened in 2008 when the municipal government decided that dogs could not be higher than 35 centimeters because, and that was the no big dog policy. And because large dogs were frightening to many people. And so the category in this example is pet owners. The network is citizens of Beijing. But people in Beijing had no motivation to rally. The pet owners had no motivation to rally or to create a movement around an issue until there was something to push against. And when they did, they coalesced. So we have networks and categories and a symbol of a dog. And that's the theory.
So the point is that or maybe you can explain what the point is that movements have always been forming in this way. I mean, the new online social movements have a lot of new characteristics, but they share many with pre-internet type
movements. That's correct. What the internet does is it functions as an accelerator. So the internet makes it much simpler to find symbols and to raise flags and to gather communities underneath those symbols. It also makes it easier to find people who fall into the same kind of category as you might be. And so the idea that we have, for instance, with the story of Kony 2012, as many people probably know this story of a video that went viral a month ago that garnered several million, 100 million visitors within 2 weeks. And on the face of it, we're surprised by something like that. But really, we shouldn't be, because it's a massive community of people, a massive network that lies dormant. And the question is, when are people going to, when will that network of people cross with a category of others? And what will happen as a result? From an intellectual framework, we should expect that this kind of thing happens all the time at different levels. Because it's always going to be a matter of whether or not those symbols cross. And this is a description of kinds of networks that kind of form and how we understand ourselves. So, pre-existing communities available as a network for organizing social action. Political parties, religions, all sorts of functions. So if we look at the Arab uprisings again, the Muslim Brotherhood is an example of a pre-existing community. Came late to the party, but once they got there, they were pretty organized. New network forms in response to an issue. This is a community of people who maybe they didn't realize they had something in common. They didn't realize that they needed, as a category, to form a network. But once they did have a motivation, they could build it quickly. And then old organizations working in new ways is an idea of, for instance, a company or a corporation who decides to change their working practice and reinvents themselves into a new form. All of these things are going on all the time, but they're all kinds of, if we're thinking about when we see a movement, these are frames that are useful for us in trying to understand when they will happen. So, what's new about online citizen media movements?
Well, I think what we've seen in so many movements, recently, both the Occupy movement, Al-Qaeda, yeah. Ideas are more important than leaders. The leaders are standing back. You have these decentralized, non-hierarchical structures. And there are a lot of other things that online movements share in common in terms of strategies and the way that they work, the kind of language and culture they attract.
Yeah, Yep. But what we see most importantly in this context is that the ideas are, in a sense, moving through crowds or moving through networks of people. And each one of us has the opportunity to enact or perform, in the earlier language of the categories, perform those ideas in different iterations and in different places. So we see with movements of ideas through online social networks is almost a ripple effect of ideas as they flow from place to place, performing a new iteration based on local concerns. And that is also true in other in offline contexts. So again, we try not to make a strong division between the online world and the offline world as if they're two separate spheres. The point is that it functions as an accelerant. It functions as a new way of providing or passing on information. Mm.
It's happening much more quickly, not just across the world, but also across time and space. Mm-hmm. And some movements are large or become large in the global consciousness. The Egypt social media, the way that social media became so informative and perhaps influential in organizing Arab uprisings. This is an example of a big one, that everybody has their eye on. But there are also examples of much more local movements. This is an example from Russia after forest fires that spread from Moscow and across the region in
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2010.
Online activists set up a map using a piece of software called Ushahidi, where they were tracking new instances of forest fires. But their main goal was to help people who needed to connect people who needed help with people who wanted to volunteer assistance. So if somebody's house had burned down and they needed baby clothes, the volunteers could say, "I have some, I'll bring them to you," and the map helped connect them. And what's interesting about this very local example is that it was actually inspired by activity that happened in Africa. The software that they used was developed in Kenya. They have been following different implementations of it in different parts of the world. And that's not unique to this project or so many other movements that we see taking shape online. Mm-hmm. People learn from each other's tactics and strategies. They watch how online activists in Europe are doing things, or in Africa, or Asia. And it's almost as though each new implementation adds something extra to the mix. And you have to wonder, how do people find out about each other's online projects? How is it that social media becomes more and more influential in such similar ways, in such completely different contexts? How does that happen? And yeah.
Well, the other interesting part of this story is that in the Russian context, prior to this event, online organizing and online social movements and the blogosphere in general was basically dismissed as an influential force. And we often hear that this can't happen, X can't happen in this country. That's not the way our people are. There's always an exception to that rule. And Russia was an exception to that rule 2 years ago. The idea that mass protests around a faked election could occur in the Russian context was a fantasy 2 years ago. And of course, it's easy to forget that. But this kind of movement can penetrate and has been shown to more explicitly. It's not a question of whether I believe it or don't believe it. Empirically, it is happening. And it's happening. It is moving through those crowds. In this case, the guys who started it were Globalvoices authors, and they met through Globalvoices. So, but they could have met through many other contexts as well. That's just a circumstance. So this is a timeline of Globalvoices analytics over a 4-year period, roughly. And when we talk about many local events and occasional mass events, we actually can see that there's a rhythm over time to how that behavior is. So, because Globalvoices is, as our authors and our community, we're always looking for instances of movements and reporting on them as they occur. And in a sense, the baseline, this is by week. So you see on average we've got 50,000 people visiting us a week, unique visits. And we see that these rhythmic spikes are events where something that's occurred in a local context has become global in effect or regional in effect. And then many smaller spikes where we've seen smaller events that occur. So it tells us from an analytic perspective that we should be expecting this kind of thing to happen on an ongoing and rolling basis. What are we talking about next? It's a good thing we have this PowerPoint. Yeah.
I don't remember.
I think we've talked about that already, actually.
Yeah.
So we're going to move on. So this slide is...
This builds on the graph you saw before with the attention span, where you saw the spikes. Those are stories where everybody needs to know the latest information about what some online movement is doing. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a different way of looking at how that mass attention span forms. Yeah. This is a Twitter cloud?
This is a Twitter map of conversations around Egypt during the Arab uprising.
On Twitter. And I think the reason that we find it so interesting also to look at is that inside each of those round circles, there's a name of a person, their Twitter handle. So, I mean, it looks like a mass of just dots and people and activity talking, but there are names within them, and we know who they are, and we can see how their activity spreads out further to other people.
And so there's several compelling things about this map. In addition, so on the left you have the English language Twitter sphere. On the right you have the Arabic language Twitter sphere. And so you can see who is influential within each community. The larger the dot, the more influential they are in terms of the number of networks, the number of retweets and links that they have. The most curious part is the purple people in the middle. And those are the translators. Those are the people who are acting as a filter or an osmotic lens from one language to another. And if we ask the question, how do people find out about information coming out of other cultures and other contexts, and how does it get passed through? This is a graphic representation of that activity. And Globalvoices authors are both participants in this network and observers of it. And so it's quite compelling for us in that context.
And it's a particularly large example, but you could take different online social movements in Africa, and you could make a similar map, and it would just be smaller. Mm-hmm. And you would see different links between activists or people who are online in different regional contexts and different.
And it shows us
countries.
very graphically as well that it's small and persistent acts that matter in this kind of network. So what's different about online social networks is a diversity, online citizen media as a movement is a diversity of voices which collectively or cumulatively have an effect. And so we see that that the force of many participants actually forms a shape, forms a symbol. Here's another representation of the same event. And the green dots, this was for graphic representations. This was made by one of our community members, a computer scientist named Gila Lotan. And he pulled out the Globalvoices authors as a graphic representation to show where they fit within the network. But many of the people who are the largest dots are people that are well known. And interestingly, as well, most of the people who are most influential in the network are mostly in the citizen media space rather than in the mass media space. The last slide we have, I think. This is a map of the Globalvoices communities based on a network analysis. And the way this map works is that the size of the dot is the influence on the network. Its location on the map means the centrality of its influence within the network. This is built by analyzing the top 10,000 blogs that link to Globalvoices. So this is a graphic representation of those communities. And the clusters are built based on people's own semantic behavior. And it's a set of roughly 10 different algorithmic measures that form these clusters in terms of their shapes. So the closer they are together, the more interlinked they are, and the colors are based on their own language communities, based on how people self-identify. And so we see here graphically that communities that overlap with each other actually are talking to each other and linking more and more to different contexts. So we asked the question again, how do we find out about how social movements iterate through cultures and through networks? And this is the answer. They iterate, we can see graphically, through communities and through common languages, through common symbols that we share.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens in large ways and sometimes small ways, but I don't think that in the Globalvoices context that we would consider like the factors for success aren't necessarily very closely tied to size.
No.
You know, or even whether a movement is successful. I mean, there can be so many different ways to evaluate the success of online media activity. And over time, we can just see how these things grow and grow and grow.
Yeah, and these maps get really interesting when you start to do longitudinal analysis. So this snapshot occurred in autumn of 2011. And you notice here at the bottom that the Russian language space is all kind of by itself. And they're not really talking to everybody else. And that kind of puts forward and maybe agrees with the idea that Russia is an exception, right? Russia is a special case. If we did this map today, we might see a pretty different picture in terms of where Russia is in the relationship with the rest of the network, because this happened before the protests around the electoral reform. And we've seen an explosion of social media and citizen media content coming out of Russia and being paid, both being followed by the rest of the world and following the rest of the world. So this shape is, it's just a moment in time.
And Globalvoices isn't, I mean, there's so many other things happening beyond Globalvoices, which is, in the scope of the internet, a relatively small site project.
That's right.
But it's a microcosm of what is happening. And we are trying to build these links between citizens in different countries who are engaged in this kind of activity so that they can learn from each other and perhaps get a feeling of belonging to a global movement. And so when we ask the question, is it a global movement? It's also partly asking, look, if it's not, can we make it a global movement?
Does it want to be a
Does
global
it want to be one?
Because intention is part of it. It's not enough to say we contend against different systems, such as how is citizen media and the way we construct our communities different from commercial mass media or governmental mass media, which, the typical the difference, of course, is with mass media you have abundant audience and scarce attention. And with mass media, with network media, you have scarce attention and abundant audience. And so abundant producers and abundant talk. So, but does that actually mean that they're contending against something? Are we trying to do something differently? And that takes us to the question of intention. Do we want to build it as a community, as different communities?
And what happens next? I mean, even if we can't control it, what is the next frontier for this kind of activity? Over the past year or two, we've seen how citizen media activists have become very good at using these tools for reporting, at gaining international attention for various causes. But what happens next? What happens after the initial online mapping projects? When do we get into areas of government transparency? There are all these different frontiers that are slowly being explored and expanded. But how do we affect them? How do we try and direct it?
Or education. We ran into a friend of ours just before we got on stage, and she's talking about whether or not to give up tenure because, the internet's going to exploit education just like it exploded journalism. So what's the path for that? So that's our presentation. And what we're hoping is that for the next half hour, we can have a conversation with you. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts about these ideas and also perhaps talk about some examples and some concepts about where you think and where we all think that these movements and it might go, and if we think it's a fair idea to talk about this kind of effort as a movement.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ja, ich glaube auch auf schwarzen, auf Englisch. Und ja, das war schon, das wäre super so.
Great.
If there are any questions?
Yeah, for questions.
Comments?
No? Yeah, Sasha has a question.
Hello. Hi. So wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. There's so many interesting things that you raised and so much amazing work that Globalvoices has done. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of what are some of the processes like where you have internal tensions between different people within the Globalvoices network, especially as, you know, certain social movement cases, mobilizations, uprisings, you know, you may have people that reflect many different sides of a particular moment or mobilization. And so how do you deal with some of those tensions, and maybe talk about, you know, an example and what that kind of looks like for you?
I think internally, you know, when we work, we've been blessed to have pretty much a harmonious community. I think a lot of the people who are drawn to this kind of research and writing and thinking are consensus seekers and like to see things from different perspectives. So we've had quite few of the kind of arguments you would have over Middle East or, you know, religion, or there seems to be a kind of culture attached with this kind of online movements that you can track back all the way to the earliest blogs. And I don't know where that comes from either. But there is kind of an internet culture that's kind of pervasive, and you know, people accept you for who you are, you know, people are anonymous online, kind of. But we do see that tension in trying to cover what's happening. So, for instance, in Iran, I mean, there was so much coverage of blogs and Twitter in Iran during those protests during the election, but you would think from reading any newspaper in the United States or in Europe that everyone who was on the internet in Iran was in favor of the protesters, against the government. But that's simply not the case. There are, you know, hundreds, thousands of bloggers who are pro-Ahmadinejad and who are, you know, equally using these new technologies in similar, you know, with similar strategies in similar ways. And you have those examples in almost all these cases, you know, because these are spaces of contention.
Yeah, and John Kelly, who made this map, also made a map of the Iranian blogosphere that shows very clearly that there are Twelvers and Shias and conservative politicians and a huge section of poetry lovers in the Iranian blogosphere. So we see those kinds of diversities in every language blogosphere, in every context. I think one of the things that's interesting about the way Globalvoices work is that we don't actually require that people are more than welcome, in fact encouraged to have different views around the world, about the world, but we have a basic meeting point in terms of our behavior, in terms of what we do, which is to try to find all perspectives on a given issue and to give them all weight. And I think that that's the common activity that we perform as a community.
There's also a bias of being, you know, pro-human rights and pro-free speech.
I mean, to do that, to want to do that, you probably bring that bias with you. So it is a bit of a self-selection process, for sure, even though we are a volunteer community.
But the attitude is one of acceptance that there are many different points of views and acknowledging that it's part of a bigger thing. I mean, the beautiful thing about being, you know, following these things really over long term instead of just when, you know, all the media's attention is on it, is that you step back a little and you have a greater overview of what's happening, I think.
Yeah.
Other questions?
There's a microphone around here somewhere. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering about the influence and the connection between those movements. You described Globalvoices as a movement in this case instead of maybe a source of information. In terms of our mainstream media or other kind of media, how they are using all this production of whatever, movements or information or something. And is there any real connection in that sense? I'm saying this because I'm coming from the International Journalism Festival in Perugia in Italy, where there were many, many people from all over the world, from the BBC, Columbia University, Italian mainstream media, German, and so on. And we had several panels talking about that kind of, you know, social media are information sources, or only the mainstream media can provide information. So what is our kind of role, or how do we fit together? Because I have the feeling that even that at the end of 4 days, that kind of integration is gone. A few years ago, I had the feeling there was much more integration between mainstream media, like we had the experiment with the BBC and others. I talked with the BBC guy, he said, no, I don't care at all. We are the only one providing the whole truth. And we don't care about you guys, essentially. We had a panel together. So my point is this, those are movements, okay? How can we integrate those movements in the mainstream media information, how this can process go on?
I think a lot has changed over the years, like you say. In the early days, Global Voices played such an important role in even just describing what a blog was to a lot of international news organizations. We worked with Reuters, we worked with a lot of big news agencies and trying to help them understand how this could possibly become a source for reporting. And they would be so confused by the fact that there were people in countries like China where there was censorship that they could still get online and they could communicate. So there was a long learning curve, I think, until we've reached to this point where you look at the coverage from Syria or somewhere, and almost all the sources are anonymous activists, online activists or digital activists or whatever they call them. And all these news organizations are now doing a lot of the curation and research that we used to be the only ones who are doing. I mean, that has changed enormously. I think the difference is that we're following stories regardless of whether they're interesting to the mainstream media. And that's how we occasionally can end up scooping them, for instance, by identifying that something big was going to happen in Tunisia long before mainstream media caught on to the fact that this could lead to the fall of Ben Ali. It didn't seem like an important story, but we were covering it and we were there. Mainstream media still, to this day, has, they have a limited attention span. They'll swoop in, just like they used to send in a foreign correspondent. They do similar things with their digital attention span. Swoop in, see what people are doing, and then leave again when they need to move their attention to something else. So that's where I think it's significant for us to have built a movement or a community that's following these things over time, because our goal is different, and we care about slightly different things. But we also acknowledge that without media attention, a lot of these social movements go nowhere. I mean, it's such an important component of the growth, the failure, success of a social media instance.
Yeah, mass media certainly still has a large effect, and the BBC, for the BBC to say this is not important is simply, they simply don't think that. They think it's very important. They've had a unit that is dedicated to parsing citizen media content for about 4 years now, I think. And so they pay a lot of attention to it. But of course, they're an institution and they have a steady stream of funding, so they have the ability and the resources to build a hierarchy. And I read the BBC all the time. I think it's really important. But I want to point to a slightly different idea, which is that there are studies about how mass media, traditional journalism, how to use the words, but traditional journalism for now, covers stories in comparison to how citizen media covers stories. And there's a really interesting study about that compares the New York Times and Globalvoices and Nicholas Kristof's Twitter feed in terms of how they covered the Egyptian revolution. And they saw a distinct difference. They did content analysis over a period of about 2 months, and they saw a distinct difference in behavior in terms of the bias towards the kinds of coverage that each of these communities displayed. The mass media bias, in this case the New York Times, conformed to the expectations of the researchers, which is that they privileged the authorities, official sources over unofficial sources in terms of news stories. They privileged sensationalism and conflict over other processes and other events that were occurring during that time. And they disparaged protesters. So, and this is a very common lens if you look at social science studies of communication studies of media behavior. That's a pretty common scenario. In comparison, both the individual authors or writers' Twitter feed and Globalvoices displayed much more sympathy for and willingness to cover people who were protesting. Spent much more time looking at processes and issues behind the subject rather than the sensationalism and the conflict. And this is theoretically the newspaper of record for North America. So there is actually a distinction that we can measure or we can see in terms of those behaviors. There are some others in terms of online behavior. So citizen media, the processes and the practices to link to others that are outside of your network, to build a network which is distributed and not based on an institutional relationship. And the point of mass media, the BBC almost never links outside of the BBC. Solana, we had a project with the BBC 2 years ago, and Solana sat in the newsroom of the online office for 2 weeks, and we linked Globalvoices onto their homepage, and they were very, very excited because they never got to do that, and it was a huge experiment for them, and it felt very, very risky for them to be able to direct traffic off of their page, because they have an organizational mandate to keep people on their site.
And this is also, I mean, just like citizen media activists are influencing each other and changing behavior, I think mainstream media and citizen media are working so much in symbiosis with each other that they also influence each other's behavior. We know that citizen media has had an impact on how people see journalism, how journalists report stories, a whole bunch of different things in terms of those behavior, and it also works the other way around. We know that citizen media activists tailor certain content or information
or performances
so that media can use it, and they feed off each other. So one doesn't exist without the other, really.
Yeah, it's definitely not a zero-sum game. You've got a question.
I'm interested in a topic you mentioned before. So you are in contact with a lot of bloggers around the world. So how are they dealing with internet censorship and surveillance? For example, in China, is it getting harder for them to get the message out, or what's the overall development in that regard?
So this conversation is premised on the idea that there's an internet that's not broken. And of course, we're going to hear from other people at this conference that the internet is breaking, how the internet is breaking, and in different ways. Part of the question about whether or not citizen media can be a movement is based on the idea that we are also contending for a system which remains open. And so I would say that privacy movements, tools to allow privacy, to allow the free flow of information, they're not the end, but they are a tool to allowing us to shape and form those kinds of things. Now, I would say sometimes we tend to think too much about the technology and not enough about the regulatory world that we live in or our own culture, because so many of the tools that exist to get around internet censorship are there because somebody else has built an obstruction, whether it's a technical obstruction or a legal obstruction or a physical obstruction in terms of internet access or in bullying people or imprisoning them. So I always try to look at that question within the larger framework of how we're behaving and why it is that we need to build root-arounds in the first place. And the ultimate, for me, if I were to say this is a movement, the ultimate goal would be to have a massive society in which the structure of an open internet is an accepted norm and enforced. And that's an ideal. And so if we're contending for that, then that's a broadly stated goal. There are many local movements and efforts that are employing lots of different tactics to try to reach that end, but if I see this as a movement, that would be the goal.
But there's also, I think when you ask that question, there isn't an easy answer because you have several different things happening at once. Some things get easier and some things get harder. The censorship gets much fiercer, much more technically advanced, just like the surveillance, but so do the different tools to get around it. I mean, in that way, it's like constant warfare, no? But you also have, in terms of people, there have always been people willing to take risks or feeling that they had to take risks to speak out against injustice. And in that way, it's the same. But I think with the growth in importance or influence of citizen media, there are also more people who are willing to take those risks because they see the potential advantages also growing. There are more people listening in many cases. So it's also when you're thinking personally about whether to dare do something or stick your neck out. Part of that judgment call is whether you think it will lead to your goal.
And that gives us, all of us who care about these issues, it creates a concomitant new community of people who are dedicated to thinking about the best tactics to secure yourself, the best practices to make sure that you have all of the knowledge and information you need so that you can act as autonomously as possible if you do that, make that decision. And that largely grassroots network of people is also very, very influential and important in this space, in trying to come up with the best tools for defense and for security.
But no doubt it is getting more dangerous in many, many places, because the government also realizes that this is something that has potential to challenge them in a lot of power
as
struggles.
with any movement, there's no guarantee there's a win, right? So it's not a determined phenomenon. It's many people trying to build something. Yeah. Any other questions? Adil. Great.
Hi.
Hi, Adil.
How are you doing? I have a couple of questions. So first is very, very quick. What are the white dots standing for?
Oh,
on
sorry.
this graph?
That's Globalvoices community.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
Right
It's the core blogging, the core platforms of the GV sites, the many sites. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second question is about the presentation. Well, if we take the movements as causes, whether it is a strength that they are decentralized and non-hierarchic, because well, take a look at Egypt, where following the great unrest and the revolution, the military just took over and got the benefit from the situation. And in Russia, it is also decentralized. It is very horizontal, and well, after the wave of enthusiasm, it is currently pretty much curtailing.
Yep, very much so.
Wouldn't it be an advantage for the horizontal campaigns to gain some hierarchy at some point?
Well, I mean, the short answer is we really don't know. There's a long-term. I'd love to study that over a 20-year period, because it may be that what we're seeing is new communities that. I mean, for instance, looking at Russia now, the move is for many of those people who gain prominence through that first grassroots effort to go into local politics. They're running for office on their local city councils, or municipalities. They're trying to start at the bottom based on local community actions. If they do that, maybe over a period of time, they will wind up building a new kind of hierarchy. And certainly, governments are not going away. And we organize our entire planet, our nations and our states, based on a set of very strict hierarchical rules. And those, we're not going to break the Westphalian system anytime soon. So that is a fact of life. And I think what we would have to see is, in asking the question about contention, is what kinds of tactics would allow communities that form quickly to maintain a presence when they are confronted with the fact that they have to get voters out, or they have to all behave, in a similar way. We see that sometimes that's occurred, around SOPA and ACTA, for instance. But again, it doesn't mean they'll win. And I think this is a rapidly evolving space, and people are trying lots of things, and we'll see lots of failures.
There's also we have a way, again, of seeing online social movements as something being very separate from the traditional structures of party politics, government politics, or other grassroots type of activism. But those communities are also merging and meeting. The lessons of citizen media are being carried over into all kinds of more traditional hierarchical structures as well. Just like they're pervasive now in traditional media, they're also becoming more and more, all the presidents of Africa who are on Twitter, all the different new open government initiatives that we see. I mean, these new ways of communicating and organizing are also seeping into more traditional structures. So maybe it will all merge somewhere.
At some point, yeah. That's why I say I don't really know the answer to that. But it's fascinating to participate and to study it. Yeah. So.
One more question.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, Jay.
I came in a little bit late, but you made a comment about effectively how we need to respect networks neutrality, and we need to think beyond circumvention. And when we think about circumvention, we have to remember that that's because there's a problem.
That's right.
I'd like to suggest an alternative, which is we'll never be able to trust the network because the economic incentives are such that people will always be rent-seeking, or worse. Why not instead build technology that allows us to, through code, create those desires and to ensure that they're enforced through strong mathematics so we don't have to be hoping that people who historically oppress us will stop oppressing us? I mean, I feel like that's part of what the dialogue is about, which helps with the policy side. But we actually need people who are working on that policy to understand that policies is only as strong as the people that can make it. So is it possible that we can work together on that to try to do it and not ever hope that the networks will just become neutral?
I would never put this on something as amorphous as hope. I mean, as the Russians say, hope dies last, but it dies. I think that this is why I'm talking about intention and contention, because these are very deliberate processes. This is a matter of saying what the issue is and then trying to perform a solution, or iterating on what those solutions might be. And absolutely, the internet is a technical beast, and you as a coder know this much better than I do. Building a strong infrastructure for that, a strong network that is resilient enough to allow for this kind of idea to exist over time and not be broken requires that intention. It requires that people build it and maintain it. And if we don't, then we lose it. And I agree with that position. Solana?
And it's also, I mean, that's also why this amorphous thing that could be a global movement, those are ideals that need to be learned into that behavior. How should people's relationship to a global corporate giant like Facebook or, soon Twitter be? Those are things that need to be learned and studied and spread, just like all the other tools of our activism and
we also don't think of this as something that exists only in the online space. This is emphatically part of our physical world, and it's not only in the nonprofit or in the civic space. It's in the corporate space too. We were talking about Airbnb as a great example of this. If everybody uses a tool like this to start renting apartment rooms from each other, then we create a different kind of tourism. We create a different kind of community set of relationships in which we all work with each other rather than through a corporate network whereby we're staying in anonymous hotel rooms. We build a different culture if we do that. And money is not an antagonist in that context. It's potentially a benefit. So as you say, shaping the structure so that our natural impulses lead to something, our natural desires lead to something which is a community that people want to live in. That's the vision that I would imagine in responding. I think we're going to get kicked off the stage. Thank you very much for listening to us and for participating. That's us. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much.